Thanks. So we're not going to stand yet. I'm going to give you an introduction, and then we'll read the scripture. All right. So this is today is redeemed from death to life. This is our Advent theme, and meeting your deliverer. We're going to look at Ruth chapter 2 for this today, and today is that third Sunday in Advent. It's really fun. Advent season. We have seen the genealogy of Jesus in Luke, tracing Jesus' ancestry, his lineage, all the way back to Adam. God began a time of grace with Adam and Eve, right? He covered their nakedness by killing an animal. And he gives them skins to cover themselves. And he also makes a promise. While he's making this declaration of punishment to Eve, he also makes a promise, and that is that serpent is going to bruise the heel of your seed, meaning Jesus. Satan is going to come after Jesus, and we saw that time and again. But Jesus' heel is going to crush the head of the serpent. Right? He makes that promise. Jesus is going to defeat Satan in all of his deeds, all of them. Jesus is going to destroy him. And we also see in God's plan, the destruction, it's foretold, God's love and care for Adam and Eve. He gives them hope, gives all of us hope. And now we look in retrospect, and Jesus is that promise fulfilled. So last week we considered the covenant of another ancestor of Mary and Joseph, and that was Abraham. Changing his name from Abram to Abraham, we saw that God gave Adam a future that included being a family of a multitude of nations. We clearly see that Jesus, in his coming in human history, he brings all the works of Satan that are destroyed, but also at the same time he brings about this gathering of the nations. I have been to nations upon nations. Now we're not talking geopolitical nations. We're talking ethnic nations. Meaning this, like the nation of the Hopi tribe, okay? The nation of the Navajo, those languages. And we see it all around the world. India has 1,600 languages and cultures. One nation does. Has nations within a nation. Jesus, he's calling people from all these nations. And because Abraham is that ancestor, there's this multitude of nations that happen because Jesus came and because Abraham was that man who brought about just one nation, Israelites. Just one. If God said, I'm going to make you a multitude of nations, you'd think they wouldn't have fertility problems. First guy, Abraham, had 2 sons. One wasn't even with his wife. He was with his wife's handmaid. Then you have the next one, Isaac. He only has, he doesn't have a huge number of kids. So you look at this and you go, wow, Jesus is the fulfillment of that promise. This week and next week, we're going to look closely at the central work of Jesus Christ in his gospel. He's the redeemer of the human race through his atoning death, right? He pulls us all back. He redeems us. A beautiful picture of that role of redeemer, of redeeming someone, is the person of Boaz in the genealogy of Jesus. Another person in the genealogy of Jesus. So we hit Adam, with Abraham, now we're going to Boaz. This week and next week we'll look at Boaz. And this week we look at his entrance into Ruth's life. And next week we'll look at his activity on her behalf. So this is an exciting time. In chapter 1, Ruth, in this book of Ruth, I'm not going to read you chapter 1. I'm going to read you chapter 2 today. But in chapter 1, I need you to know this. Ruth is Naomi's daughter-in-law, and it feels like God's hand is just hard upon Naomi and upon her family. There's a famine in Judah, so they all move. Naomi, her husband, Elimelech, and her 2 sons, Mahon and Chilion. They all 4 of them move. They sell their land. They get a bunch of money. And they're thinking, we're doing great. There's a famine here. We'll go to Moab. They got food there. They go there. Elimelech dies. Now, 10 years later, these daughter-in-laws show up. The two sons marry. Not a long period of time happens. Those two sons die. Yikes. That's a lot of death in one family in a short period. Well, in 12 years or so. And here's a woman who thought she had everything. Thought they were going to survive, be the family, and be okay. She thought she'd probably die in Moab, an old woman with little grandkids all around her. What happens? She hears that there's food finally back in her homeland. It says she's not among people where she, from birth, spoke their language. She's not that. She's among strange people, and so she decides to go back home. And one daughter-in-law decides to follow her. And so what does she say? Blow after blow, she says in chapter 1, verse 13 to 20, the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. She feels like she's so oppressed by God and so bitter against the providence that has happened in her own life that she doesn't even see any signs of hope in the future. She's just like down, as you can imagine. She knows there's a God. She knows he's almighty. He rules the nations. He rules the persons. And she knows that he has dealt bitterly with her. Her life is a tragedy. If the book had ended at the end of chapter 1, you'd be like, you'd be down. You'd be like, yikes. What she has forgotten in all of her bitter experiences is that God is plotting glory for his own children. God loves you. And if we would believe this and remember it, we would not be as blind as Naomi seemed to be when God begins to reveal his grace. Sweet providence, sweet goodness from God, as well as bitter, comes into Naomi, into her life in chapter 1. But she can't see it. God lifts the famine, opens a way home for Naomi. She could go home. That's a good thing. He gives her an amazing, devoted daughter-in-law who loves her to accompany her. That's a good thing. She doesn't see that. He preserves a kinsman of Naomi's husband who will someday marry Ruth and preserve Naomi's line. But Naomi sees none of this. At the end of chapter 1, she says to the townspeople of Bethlehem, I went away full. The Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has afflicted me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Call me Mara. Bitterness. So God has this woman, and we see it. Ruth and bitter Naomi settle in Bethlehem. Chapter 2, the mercy of God becomes so obvious that even Naomi will recognize it. In this chapter, we see in this chapter the meeting of the destitute Ruth and the kinsman redeemer Boaz. So please stand for Ruth chapter 2. It's a long chapter. If you need to sit down, that's fine. If you need to stay seated, that's fine. Unless you're a young person. Now, verse 1. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go on. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is a young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people you did not know. The Lord repay you for what you have done. A full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Then she said, I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. Verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. And she rose to glean. Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves. Do not reproach her. And also put out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean. And do not rebuke her. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw that she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? Where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law whom she had worked, and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said, beside, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with this young woman, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young woman of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. The grass withers, the flowers fade, the barley gets harvested and goes away, but the word of our Lord, it stands forever. Amen. You may be seated. In verses 1 to 7, we meet Boaz. We see the character of Ruth, and we sense a very merciful providence behind this scene, the providence of God. Boaz, we learned, was a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's long-deceased husband. Immediately we realize that things are not as bleak as Naomi had suggested back in chapter 1, where she gave the impression that there was no one left for Ruth, no one left for Orpah to marry, to carry on the line of their husbands. For the person reading the story for the very first time, Boaz is like a bright crack in a cloud of bitterness hanging over Naomi, and it's going to get bigger and bigger. For example, in verse 1, we find out that he's a man of wealth. It says that in the King James Version, the New King James Version, it's translated wealth. And one of them says he's very wealthy. More important than that, in verse 4, it shows us what kind of man he is. He's a man of God. Why else would the storyteller pause to record the way Boaz greeted his servants? Why would you do that? Why would you say, and he said to his servants, what does he say to them? Behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. If you want to know a man's relation to God, see how far it goes. We find out with this man, his life is saturated with God. Even his greetings include God. And the people that are around him, his employees, know that. So that their lives are saturated with God, and they greet him back as a man who is a man saturated with God. Boaz was such a God-saturated man that his whole farming business and his whole relationship to all his employees was filled with God. He greeted them with God. We'll see in a minute. These were not just pious platitudes. He cares about God. So besides meeting Boaz in verses 1 to 7, we see the character of Ruth, which is going to be very crucial in what happens in this chapter and what this chapter intends to teach us. First, we see Ruth's initiative to care for her mother-in-law. Notice in verse 2, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. She said to her, go, my daughter. Naomi does not command Ruth to go out and work. Ruth is saying, let me go to the field. Let me go get some ears of grain. What we see here is Ruth has committed herself to Naomi with a devotion that she's willing to take initiative and to provide for her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law was getting to the age where she couldn't go out and hang out in the sun all day and pick grain and glean in a field. And so Ruth knew that if they were going to survive, if they were going to eat that day, she had to go. She had to make sure that they were going to be able to eat. She takes the initiative to provide for her mother-in-law. Secondly, we see Ruth's humility. She knows how to take initiative without being presumptuous. In verse 7, the servants report to Boaz how she's approached them that morning. She said, he's reporting this to Boaz, the servant is, pray, let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came. She has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. She's not a woman that demands a handout. She doesn't presume even the right to glean, even though it's written in the Old Testament law. Do not harvest all the way to the corners of the fields, but leave the corners till the corners are going to come. Let them harvest that area. And if you drop some, don't pick it up. Keep going. Let the foreigners pick that up. She doesn't demand the handout. All she wants to do is gather up the leftovers after the reapers are done, and she asks permission even to do that. It's incredible humility. All she wants to do is gather up the leftovers. She's like another foreign woman who came to Jesus and said, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs, to which Jesus responded by extolling her faith. Ruth knows how to take initiative. She's not just pushy or presumptuous, but she's meek and she's a humble woman. Thirdly, we see her industry. She's an amazing worker. Verse 7 says, she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Verse 17 goes on to say she has gleaned until evening, and then before she quit, she beat out what she gleaned. She didn't finish the job half-baked. She did it all the way. She measured it, and she took it home to Naomi. There's no doubt that the writer wants us to admire and to copy Ruth. She takes initiative to care for her destitute mother-in-law. She's humble and meek, does not put herself forward presumptuously. She works hard from sunup to sundown, and her initiative, her lowliness, her industry are worthy traits for us to emulate. There wasn't anything in this woman that says, oh, she's a terrible person. No, it's all wow. It's all wow stuff. It's hard work. I spent some time throughout the world where they have to harvest by hand. And it's the rice harvest. And you see them cutting it by hand. I have one of the cutters that they use. It's a knife. And they grab it, then they put them into these bundles, and then they have a big box in the middle of the field, and they just beat out the rice kernels. It's hard work. It's backbreaking work because you're bent over all day long. This is an amazing book. So we see God's merciful redemption and his providence for this woman. I think we want our lives to be a straight line, just like I-70 through Kansas. God says, no, it's going to be more like Black Bear Road outside your Telluride. You can be on the opposite side of the mountain from Black Bear Road, and you see the line of the 4x4s coming down, and they're backing up because the hairpins are so tight make one turn. It has to back up. It's terrible. That's how our lives are. Naomi wanted her life to be a straight line. We're going to have a husband, a kid, we're going to have kids. Kids are going to have kids, get married, have kids. We're just going to have a straight line. They end up in Moab to get 4 wives. Come back without any of the men that she went with. So here we have in verse 7. We start seeing a glimpse of God's providence in all these turns, in all this difficulty. Notice verse 3. So she set forth and went out and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. She happened to come? She happened to come? You don't have to write theology in every line when you write the Bible or a story. It's sometimes to leave something a little bit ambiguous so your readers can fill in the blank. She happened to come? God brought her to that field. God moved her to that field. Elimelech's relative, that one, the guy that's wealthy, the guy that would care for her, the guy that would make sure that she is protected. Naomi, in her grand theology of God's sovereignty, is the one who will actually get the answer of why all that happens. The answer is God. The providence, the merciful providence of God. Ruth happened to come to Boaz's field because God's gracious and that he's sovereign even when he's silent. We don't have God saying, hey, over here. He just moves it. Proverbs 16:9 says, the heart of man plans his ways, but the Lord establishes his steps. You can make all the plans you want. She had a plan that day. I'm going to go harvest. I'm going to glean behind other people. What happened? God established. He's the one that established every footstep and got her to the field that she's supposed to be. I got a funny story about gleaning. My brother-in-law and I, we went to college back in Illinois, and back then, a great thing was the high grocery stores. You could go and get stuff that was out of date. It was the original food bank. It was called a trash can. Okay? So we do that all the time. My brother-in-law, he did that all the time. One time, they invited the president of the school for dinner in their apartment. And they were seniors, so they had an apartment that had a kitchen and all that. And when they're all done, they said, we got all this out of the trash can. But we're such a wealthy nation that stuff that's out of date is still delicious. You know, and it's generally not bad. Generally. And I see those little numbers as sort of a guideline. Not a hard and fast rule. And so, here's this woman. She's going and getting the edges of the field to take care of her mother-in-law. Why has she found favor in Boaz's eyes? In verses 8 and 9, Boaz approaches Ruth and shows her kindness. Even though she's a foreigner, he provides food by telling her to work in his field and to stay close behind his maidens. He provides protection from the young men that he has working for him. He says, you don't molest this one. He provides her for her thirst by telling her to drink what these young men draw. His wealth, his godliness, his goodness begin to turn for Ruth's welfare. Now, we come to, I think, the most important interchange in the whole passage. Verses 10 through 13. Ruth raises a question which turns out to be very profound. It's one that we all need to ask God. Hardly anything in our lives is more important than the answer that we get. Now, this gets me. Verse 10. And she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, saying to Boaz, which is a question we should be saying to God. Why have I found favor in your eyes? They should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner. We should say to God, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I'm a sinner? Why have you taken notice of me? Why? Ruth knows that she's a Moabite. She has 2 strikes against her. She doesn't belong in this culture of the Israelites. She doesn't belong there. She doesn't speak their language from birth. She learned it because she married some Israelites. She married an Israelite. She doesn't have any standing, 0 standing. She has less rights and privileges than a slave who happens to be an Israelite. So this woman, she doesn't expect any special treatment. Her response to Boaz's kindness is astonishing to me. She's very different from most people today, isn't she? We expect kindness. We're astonished and resentful when we don't get our rights. In our culture, you're always right, unless somebody can prove you wrong. You go to the store and the customer is always right. When I went to Vietnam, the customer was always wrong. Always wrong. I said, how can I always be wrong? That's how she was. She was always wrong. Always wrong. There's nothing she could do that was right. And there's this man who's a stand-up man, and he comes into her life. He says, I'll take care of you, basically. My people are not going to molest you. They're actually going to serve you water. They're not going to harass you if you actually lead with them. In our world, we don't see people bowing their heads and faces to the ground. Proud people don't say thank you. Humble people are made even more humble by being treated graciously. Grace is not intended to lift us. Grace is not intended to lift us out of lowliness. It's intended to make us happy in God. What I find interesting is she didn't find favor based on merit. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Ruth asked why Boaz has treated her so graciously, and verses 11 and 12 are crucial. But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. Verse 12, the Lord will pay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Notice, when Ruth asks why she's being shown grace, Boaz does not answer, grace has no conditions. He answers her question. Why? By saying, because you have loved Naomi so much that you're willing to leave your father and mother to serve her in a strange land. Does this not mean that the writer wants us to think Ruth's love for Naomi is a work of merit to get Boaz's favor and the favor of God? Does he want us to think of grace as a kindness we earn? I don't think so. If Ruth has earned the favor of Boaz, then we must think of her as a kind of employee rendering service to Boaz, her employer, which is so valuable that he's indebted to repay her. That's not the image the writer wants to create in our minds. Verse 12 gives another image that makes the employer-employee image impossible. It's because she sought refuge under God's wings. Boaz says in verse 12 that God is really the one who is rewarding Ruth for her love to Naomi. Boaz is only the instrument of God. But now notice the words, the Lord recompense you for what you've done. Lord repay you for what you've done. A full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. This does not encourage us to picture Ruth as an employee of God, providing needed labor when he then, as an employer, rewards with a good wage. Yesterday, we drove less than a mile to go to a neighbor's house yesterday. And on that short drive, on a fence post, was an eagle. Less than 20 feet from our car. He just stayed there as we drove right by. And Lita said, "Did you see that?" I said, "No." "See what?" "I was just do. I don't expect to see an eagle on a fence post." She said, "There's an eagle right back there." Taking pictures of this eagle. The picture is that eagle under whose wings you have taken protection. The picture is that this young woman is an eaglet needing protection. She didn't come under just anybody's protection. She came under God's protection. You left your homeland. And why did she do that? Why did she do that? Because she had seen God's protection of Naomi. When they were living in Moab, she saw that God protected this woman. And she had come under the protection of God in Moab. And this woman, Naomi, was the recipient of this kindness and love of Ruth, not because she had earned it, but because God was protecting her, and she had an overflow of love for her mother-in-law. That's why. She wasn't going to earn any merit there. It wasn't like, "Oh, wow, you're amazing." You see, when a person does that, something like that, counted his protection is more important than all other protection, and sets their hope and joy on God. When somebody does that, if you plead God's value as the source of your hope instead of pleading your value as the source of God's hope, then his unwavering commitment to his own value engages all of his heart and his protection and his joy for you. It just happens that way. Seeking refuge in God and loving others. How did Ruth's love for Naomi and her leaving her own family relate to her seeking refuge under the wings of God? I don't know. We weren't there. Here's a woman who's lost her husband, who loses both of her sons to death. And we don't know what they had. But what we find is God has protected Naomi, and Ruth sees that. And Ruth goes, "I'm going to forsake my gods. I'm going to leave them behind." The whole world at that time was one big idolatrous mess. It just was, except for Israel. Even Israel had problems with idolatry. But back then, Moab, they were all idolaters. And she said in that first chapter, "I'm going to follow you. I'm going to go with you where you go, and your people will become my people." And then she says, "Your God will be my God." That's verse 16 of chapter 1. Your God will be my God. Why is that? Because she saw something in her God. Even in this huge tragedy, even in this woman who could only see the rottenness, Ruth sees something good going on. She sees that God has protected this woman. We don't know. Maybe the whole town was wiped out. These were the only two women left. We don't know. She saw a need in Naomi's life, and since God calling her to meet that need. See, the eagle moved towards Naomi, and in order to keep enjoying the refuge of God's wings, Ruth moves too and commits herself to care for Naomi. And the care she is receiving from her eagle, she receives. So, in the relation between taking refuge under God's wings on the one hand and leaving home to care for Naomi on the other hand, is that being under God's wings enabled Ruth to forsake human refuge and give herself to love Naomi. Another way to say it is that leaving home and loving Naomi are the result and the evidence of taking refuge in God. And now we see the gospel in the rest of this passage. So now back to Ruth's question in verse 10. Why have I found favor? The answer is she's taken refuge in the wings, under the wings of God, and that he has given her the freedom and desire to leave home and love Naomi. She has not earned any mercy from God or Boaz. She is not their employee. They are not paying her wages for the work. On the contrary, she has honored them by admitting her need for their work and simply by taking refuge in their generosity. This is the message of the gospel in the Old Testament and the New Testament. God will have mercy on anyone. On anyone. Anyone who humbles themselves like Ruth and takes refuge under the wings of God, God will totally have mercy on them. Jesus said in Matthew 23, verse 37, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." All the Pharisees had to do was to take refuge under the wings of Jesus. Stop justifying themselves. Stop relying on themselves. Stop glorifying themselves. But they would not. Ruth was not their model, was it? No falling on their faces before Jesus. No bowing down before Jesus. No astonishment at his grace. No. Don't be like the Pharisees. I think that's a pretty safe thing to say. Don't be like the Pharisees. I think it's a pretty safe thing to say. Be like Ruth. Throw yourself under the wing of God. That's what we see. So let's look at Naomi's theology of God's sovereignty. Let me end by getting back to this. Boaz gives Ruth all she can eat for lunch. Okay, it's starting to look good. What I noticed in this passage was something that you take for granted. How many meals are we going to have today? At least 3, right? Sometimes 4. If you're a high school boy, 5 or 6. She takes her leftovers. Does she eat them herself? No, she gives them to her mother-in-law. How many meals does she have that day? 1. That's a typical day. That's a typical day. Why does she have leftovers? Probably because she doesn't eat very much, because she's used to not eating very much. And so she had leftovers when Boaz gave her so much, and she gives it to her mother-in-law. She works until sundown. She returns to Naomi, gives her the leftovers from lunch. She tells her what has happened with Boaz in verse 20. Naomi's theology of God's sovereignty starts to serve her well. She says, verse 20, "And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." This kindness refers to the Lord's kindness, not Boaz's kindness. Boaz has just begun to show the kindness to the dead. It was God who seemed to have forsaken them. But what do we find out? It's the Lord's kindness. He's not forsaken the living, Naomi and Ruth, or the dead, Elimelech and Chilion, their husbands. It was the Lord who stopped the famine. It was the Lord who bound Ruth to Naomi in love. It was the Lord who preserved Boaz for Ruth. Ruth did not just happen to come to Boaz's field that day. God brought her there. The light of God's love has finally broken through bright enough for Naomi to see it. The Lord is kind. He's good to all who take refuge under his wings. So let us fall on our faces, bow before the Lord, confess our unworthiness, humble ourselves, take refuge under the wings of God, and be astonished at his grace. This Advent season, the God of Ruth is waiting for you to come under the protection of his wings. The God of Ruth has dealt kindly with you in every situation. You don't see it most of the time, but he has. This is the gospel. God acting. Your works will never cause him to turn towards you and be kind. He is kind, period. His cover of you is based on his delight to do so. You merely have to come under his protection. That's it. Under the wings. Next week, we see what the kinsman redeemer does to redeem this young woman. and it's wonderful. But between now and then, remember what Christ did to redeem you, to buy you back from sin. That's what he did. And now you're under the protection of his wings. Let's pray. God in heaven, we thank you that we have a book like this that is so powerful, that shows us how great you are. God, we're going to do things throughout this week, and it's going to seem like it just happened, kind of. But we know that you've directed every footstep. Help our theology to catch up to our experiences, and our experiences to be covered by our theology, where we trust that everything that happens is under your good wings, and you're protecting us and caring for us. And we, God, do not want to be like the Pharisees. We want to be those humble servants like Ruth, who we just trust you. We know that you're the good God. We've seen what you've done for others, and we want to come under the protection also. So God, you're our God. We love you. Be with us throughout this week. May we just see your hand on everything. In Jesus' name. Amen.